Good evening. I'm John Nico, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Union League Library Hour program. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Guided by the United States Constitution, the history, the values, and the spirit of the Union League, we inspire Union League members, students, and the public to be more engaged, more educated citizen leaders. We do this through exhibits and publications, through constitutional and civics educations for young people, for college scholarships to future citizen leaders, and through programs like tonight's Library Hour. Recently, during the current COVID-19 crisis, we've taken on the added job of running and fundraising for the Union League Employee Emergency Fund. My thanks to all the members and others that have contributed almost $600,000 to this great cause. Please know that your contributions are being used by families and Union League members who need the funds the most. My thanks. I also would like to thank the many members who support us all throughout the year, especially our Founder Circle and Lincoln Circle leaders. It's only through your contributions that we're able to touch the lives and teach and educate tens of thousands each year about what's most important to the Union League. So a few housekeeping items for tonight before we begin the program. For those of you on Zoom, you will be able to ask questions. There's a little down on the bottom Q&A, and if you hit that, you can ask questions of our speaker. He'll get to as many of them as he can by the end of the program. The speakers cannot hear or see you if you're on Zoom. If you're on YouTube and watching it through YouTube, you will not be able to utilize the Q&A function. Tonight's program is a co-sponsored event with the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. They're a great organization that we've partnered with both the Union League and Legacy Foundation for many years on many great events and programs. And to introduce our program tonight is the president of the Philadelphia chapter of ICAA, Mr. Stephen Hendricks. Stephen.
Good evening, and thank you to the Union League and the Legacy Foundation for generously collaborating with the Philadelphia Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. This is indeed a wonderful audience for us, and I am honored to welcome you all to the 11th Annual Alvin Home Lecture. We're very grateful to have you join us for tonight's virtual lecture on Thomas Jefferson. So we're all learning much about home lately. The inside of our homes is where our private lives unfold. But the exteriors of our homes are more public, where we intersect with our neighbors and community. The most successful exteriors are composed of similar and agreeable traditional forms. They can create public spaces that make us long to be in them. When we respond to them in this way, we feel at home in that environment because it has found a place in our heart. This is the real goal of classical and traditional architecture. It seems Thomas Jefferson understood something about these things and dedicated much of his life to perpetuating and teaching classical traditions about home. His architectural legacy includes providing a home for the Virginia state government, a home for students at the University of Virginia, and perhaps most famously, his own homes at Monticello and Poplar Forest, still enthralling throngs of visitors every year. In thanking our sponsors, it should be noted that many of them are designers, curators, architects, and builders still practicing Jefferson's architectural sensibilities today. Our jewel sponsors are Capoletti Builders, North American Window and Door, Pine Mar, Peter Zimmerman Architects, Archer and Buchanan Architecture, Ernst Brothers Builders, Freeman's Auctioneers and Appraisers, John Milner Architects, LePage Millwork, Rittenhouse Builders, and Spire Builders. Our speaker tonight is Lloyd DeWitt. He is currently the chief curator at the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, as well as the Irene Laeish Curator of European Art. Having earned his BA in Fine Art from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, he went on to achieve a master's at the University of Massachusetts and his PhD at the University of Maryland. His dissertation on the career of Dutch painter Jans Lavenza has made him a leading expert on this artist. He has organized many conferences as well as exhibits at important museums, including our own Philadelphia Museum of Art, and has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Old Dominion University, and LaSalle University. Please join me now from your home in welcoming Lloyd DeWitt, bringing us his presentation titled Thomas Jefferson Architect, Palladian Models, Democratic Principles, and the Conflict of Ideals. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's my great pleasure to take you through this wonderful project on the architectural career of our third president. We often think of him as a diplomat and as someone who is authored the Declaration of Independence. We don't think of his architectural career, but it spanned nearly his entire adult life, from his early beginnings before he was married, taking his young bride into the first buildings at Monticello, to his last days where he's installing the capitals at the University of Virginia. So it was what he called his chief pleasures, putting things up and pulling things down. It's one of his great pastimes. So we've got a lot of architecture to look at tonight, and it has great significance because Jefferson intended to beautify the country through introducing classical architecture. And since then, every courthouse, every post office, and countless other buildings have been influenced by that choice and that campaign, which was a very deliberate campaign. And he's yoked to the career of his great hero, Andrea Palladio, probably the most renowned architect, I think, in history. I think that's not unfair to say that, but someone who he really, whose cause he really championed in the colonies. So let's have a look at some pictures. So our great partner in this project was Yale University Press, who put out the wonderful catalog. I'll just skip ahead. The project began as a project about Andrea Palladio. It had its core as a project about Andrea Palladio and Thomas Jefferson, and an exhibition project, a small one put on by the Palladio Museum in Vicenza in Italy, which is Palladio's hometown and where most of his important buildings were. And he's a creature of the Renaissance, but someone who built his buildings in northern Italy, the Veneto in Venice, and whose main claim to fame were his 4 books, publicizing his career and also his models and his method of architecture in books that are still, I think, are dropped onto the desks of architecture students today. Our project is different. We used the core of the wonderful models that they'd made for that exhibition two or three years ago in Vicenza, and built around it the story of Jefferson as an architect. And we broke it down into these 5 themes and presented as a chronological journey, because what's fascinating is to watch Jefferson develop as an architect. We know he develops in many ways throughout his life, but he also develops as an architect. He begins as someone who works from books, who has a fantastic architecture library, who really is we know him as a bibliophile, someone who's just an absolute fanatic about accumulating books and knowledge. This also manifests itself in his architectural library. And he starts off as someone who really cuts and pastes and borrows ideas from a number of different sources. But as we watch him develop, especially after his European tour, he becomes his own man, and he has a mature style, something that really is unique to his own idiom and his own situation. And I think that's one of the most wonderful stories that emerges from this, is seeing this gentleman, politician, someone who's also someone who's deeply sophisticated about architecture and inventive as well, and creative. So here was the entrance to our exhibition, and you can see the wonderful Trumbull painting on the sightline, which Hartford so wonderfully lent to us. You can also see the Houdon bust, the plaster bust lent by the New York Historical Society. What we wanted to do as you walked in was present you with the most dramatic paradox in Jefferson's life. On the left, we've got the wonderful Gilbert Stuart portrait from Harvard, in grisaille, classical man, someone who's like a Roman patrician or a consul, in profile, as if he's on a coin, in black and white, as painted by a friend. On the right is The Door by John Hemmings, and you'll recognize the Hemmings name as the great family who had a great deal to do with how Monticello and all the homes were run. And they were a family of enslaved people, but who contributed a great deal. And we know that John Hemmings made this door. Recent research by our friends at Poplar Forest, where the door comes from, revealed that it was made with the same tools as the doors at Monticello. And we know from Jefferson's copious records, his daily account books, so meticulous, so detailed, that was John Hemmings. So we confront here the legacy of slavery, that all of what you see, all of his buildings, none of them would have been possible without the labor of these enslaved craftsmen. And something we wanted to emphasize in our project was their creativity and their inventiveness, something that was remarked on already in Jefferson's own day. So that paradox lies at the heart, and we wanted to make sure that that's something that we address repeatedly in the exhibition. Now, Jefferson grew up in the Wild West of Virginia, as those areas next to the mountains were known, far away from the Tidewater area. And he did spend some time at Tuckahoe, but his main base is at Shadwell, where his father had his estate. And his father was a surveyor and produced this great map with Joshua Fry. It was published in London. It's the first really accurate map of Virginia. And as a surveyor, he's laying things out, of course, so that the state, the new colony will grow in population. Having that awareness that Jefferson grows up in a family and as the son of someone who maps things out and measures and looks for order where there's chaos, I think that's a very important motif. His father dies young. Jefferson has to do a lot of growing up, but the family legacy is secure in the sense that he inherits lands and his estate and his holdings of land and arable land grows. One of the most interesting acquisitions he made was something that wasn't very arable at all, was the natural bridge, which he knew because his father surveyed it, famously enough, probably with the young George Washington in his employ. This formation, which is still astonishing to see to this day, 210-foot tall natural arch, was thought by Jefferson to show that architecture and architectural forms, specifically the arch, were rooted in nature, and nature is the key catchword for Jefferson. All of his principles of architecture have to be derived from nature. He also thought that this was one of the wonders of the country, one that made it so attractive. He kept pointing out to European friends that, in fact, America was beautiful. It had these wonders like the Natural Arch, like Niagara Falls, and like Harper's Ferry and the confluence of the two great rivers there. So nature to him is a touchstone, something he keeps going back to. This is a painting we recently acquired by Ward that shows what it looked like already in 1835. So it's a useless tract of land in most ways, but it was something that he acquired because of this feature. So he's obsessed with the connection between architecture and nature at an early stage. He buys it from the king. It's already a pre-revolutionary purchase. And it's the site of his house, though, that is one of the most amazing things. The small mountain, his larger one is behind it there. Monticello, he names it after the hill that Palladio used to build the famous Villa Capra outside of Vicenza, the little mountain. And it's there he decides to site his own house already before he's married on the top of a hill. This is, of course, folly. There's no water there, but he was determined to give it that view and that prominence and that commanding situation over nature. He was educated at the College of William and Mary. He was very disappointed in the architecture he found there. He writes in the notes of Virginia that he thought that the buildings there were rude, misshapen piles. And in fact, he said that the genius of architecture must have cast her maledictions over his state in particular. And he thought that the fact that people built in wood was a good thing because it meant that their buildings would fall apart in 50 years and tabula rasa would ensue. But he was determined to, using classical models, to inspire his fellow citizens and elevate their taste. This is how he describes his architectural journey. Of course, he's also someone that at times is associated with the abolitionist cause, both when as a young man and also later when he comes back from Europe just as the French Revolution is underway, and he's treated with a great deal of suspicion. But he inherits these three great estates and becomes one of the largest slave owners in Virginia. And on top of that, he has a certain standard of living that he feels obliged to keep up for the sake of his position. And this sinks him into debt, which he never really recovers from. And so it is that debt, and this is a story told throughout the colonies, that is that debt that really chains him to an institution that he felt was vile and wrote a great deal against. So that paradox, again, is something that we can never lose sight of as we look at his buildings. As he traveled throughout the colonies, he was aware and he befriended people who did build in the Palladian style. Certainly William Buckland was one in building the great Hammond House in Annapolis as a 5-part Palladian house with a wonderful pedimented central hallway. The symmetry reigns here. It's a beautiful, beautifully composed building that you can still see. Here's Jefferson's own drawing of that house. So he's already at a young age keeping records of what he sees and the models that he feels are important. And that's how he starts off, just like Buckland, by looking at books. He buys a Palladio, he gets a Palladio book already as a student during his student days, and he's kind of cutting and pasting from it to build using 2 different houses by Palladio as his models to build his house at Monticello. He uses a 2-story facade. This occurs, I think, as we see in this lovely model here made by friends in Italy, and that is based on one of Palladio's house and combines it with another model. And that's his method, is to learn from books. In fact, that's what Latrobe criticizes him about this. He says, oh, I'm cramped in my style because Jefferson keeps insisting that I use all his French books. Now, cutting and pasting is not an unusual habit of Jefferson's. Of course, we all know the famous example of this, the Bible that he developed as it's in fact a polyglot Bible of the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. It's, of course, a translation aid. I think it's been miscast in its history, but it had involved selecting what he thought was important. And that habit of mind, I think, is how he starts off in his career. Again, some things that we even found in our collection is some cutting and pasting of estates and cutting and pasting, of course, of families as he proceeds. This is, in fact, from our own, we found even in our own archives, we had slave documents in the Chrysler's own collection. Here is a brick from a humble brick. We even have this in our exhibition, but the point we make is an important one. There's a thumbprint in it. It's a thumbprint of an enslaved workman. We know a lot about the brick making at Monticello. The clay was dug right out of the ground. These huge kilns were set up, and the bricks were produced right there. So we always think of this as a wonderful way of tying his house to the wood and brick of the land itself. But he was aware that Palladio himself was not someone who built purely in stone, that he also used brick and plaster and made a kind of fake stone and made lightweight architecture. He was somebody who was very much, these techniques, he could see them in Palladio's books. Lloyd is very explicit about using these techniques. So his library is a marvel. He gives the first version of his library to the nation, and it's partly destroyed, but a lot of books are saved, and they often has his notation. So we see very sophisticated books. We see the orders discussed ad nauseum in his books, and it was with great detail, and people presenting opinions, different measurements of antique monuments are dredged up in these discussions. Here we see one of his Palladio book that has this signature on it, and he often annotates books and refers back to them. Here is his model of the relationship of the gentleman builder to the gentleman architect to the builder. In the Builder's Dictionary, this lovely plate shows us that the gentleman who's well dressed is instructing his builder in art. So that what this book plate, is just one of his many books, emphasizes is that the amateur architect is held up as the ideal, someone who has ideals and models in his mind. He doesn't build himself. He's not a craftsperson. He instructs the craftsperson. He informs him of the principles he has in mind. Here's a couple, again, Gibbs's rules for drawing. And you see up here in one of Jefferson's drawings, he annotates in a very clear hand, Gibbs's architecture plate 69. It tells us where his sources are. And he's very somebody who, of course, and you can see that what's showing through here, by the way, are the accounting of how much it costs to build that exact building. When you flip things over for Jefferson, you find exhaustive detail about cost accounting. Now, of course, the sad thing is he watches himself go into debt this way, but right down to dollars and pennies. This is one of the lovely garden pavilions at Monticello. It's an octagonal shape. He loves octagons. He learns about the importance of that form and its versatility early on. One thing that he never casts his eye on is anything by Palladio himself. In fact, it would have been hard for him to see anything. There were no drawings by Palladio in America. They had already been collected by Lord Burlington, and today are in the Architecture Institute in London. But they're all except for one, and it's a rather nice one at Cornell University. They have Palladio's own drawing taken from his archaeological measurements from the Temple of Vesta in Tivoli. So the model of Palladio is something that's always a bit of a distant dream for him. But he was quoted as saying, even later on, that he felt that Palladio was his Bible and one ought to stick to it. It's not something he wrote, but it's something that he did tell Colonel Coles later on. So of course, his life has this tragic interlude in which his beloved wife Martha dies, leaving him with his, just the two young daughters. And he has an opportunity to go to Europe and to see the things that he always admired from afar, working for the government. So appointed first as minister and then as minister to France. And he has the opportunity to tour England and its great gardens with John Adams. He has a habit of buying guidebooks wherever he goes, and he says how important this is. He gives advice to his young proteges on what to do when they're traveling through Europe. He says, buy maps, buy guidebooks, make sure you know what you're looking at. And this is what he himself does. And he collected these maps of great English estates. What is evident, though, is that he develops a certain opinion of these stately piles, all built on, of course, using money profits gained in the colonies. And he has very strong opinions about how those were gained. When he moves to France, he then I think looks for very different models that are in contrast to the houses he sees on these enormous estates in England. But he pays attention to both the buildings and the gardens. Look, for instance, at Kew, there's a pagoda in the background. He actually did at one point contemplate Chinese follies at Monticello. Imagine if that had gone through. The railings themselves, I think, are controversial enough. So he lives most of the time in Paris. He rents a commodious hotel himself, and one building that catches his eye as a model that he repeatedly visits. He visits so often, he says that he gets a crook in his neck because he can't quite situate his chair properly for it, is the Hotel de Salm, which today is the Legion of Honor Museum next to the Musée d'Orsay. And what he found so amazing was that it was a commodious building, very modern. It was a modern take on classical architecture. In France, he's paying a lot of attention to what we call contemporary architecture. But that it's a two-story building disguised as one story. It's modest. It looks compact. It is not extravagant, not like the things he saw in England. So to him, French architecture was giving him ideas for Monticello, and that's indeed what he does. He disguises the second story at Monticello based exactly on this model. While in Paris, he meets the lovely Maria Causeway, wife of Richard. He's introduced to her by the painter Trumbull. Maria is a free spirit, Italian of birth, accomplished artist in her own right, and someone who seemed to have a very free reign with her life. They spend quite an astonishing week together in Paris, Jefferson and Causeway, touring the major art collections, the Palais Royal, and also the Chateau at Marly, and also the Dessert de Retz, where they admired this peculiar house that looked like a broken column. Of course, it is a very neoclassical building. It's kind of funny that somebody would choose to live in something like this, but it's a sophisticated building, and it shows you the depths to which the classical idiom had been was being discussed and modified and being made modern in Paris and in France. And it's these experiences that make Jefferson into a contemporary architect. But he's not a great draftsman, and he knows it. And as a gentleman, he really can't be a great draftsman. He has a number of projects underway in the colonies. One of these he wants to make sure happens is that the Capitol building in the new capital of Richmond, Virginia, be made after classical models. He says they have the opprobrium of 1,000 years, and another place 2,000 years. So they have the approval of history. So he wants to elevate the taste by coming up with a choice example of classical architecture, following carefully a model that is still in existence that he can see. So he engages the elderly Clarisseau. Charles-Louis Clarisseau is a supreme draftsman and something of an archaeologist who traveled broadly and published a great book on the monuments of Nîmes in France, which we all know has the best preserved Roman ruins in existence. Clarisseau advises him that to follow these models, and that together they build a model for the new state house in Virginia that closely follows the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. So here you can see Jefferson's drawing in the middle, very simple, an arch detail of Monticello. You can see on the right, Clarisseau, just an exquisite drawing of the Corinthian order. And then Scamozzi on the left would have been one of the books that Jefferson would have used as a model. So he's translating it into some very simple idiom, but when you need something important done, he hires a professional, Clarisseau. And that's the relationship that we saw in the Gibbs book. He buys Clarisseau's book, and there is an example in the foreground of the monuments of Nîmes, and in the background we see the model of the State House. This is not the one that was, in fact, Jefferson and Clarisseau had made. They cast a plaster model in Paris and sent it to the colonies to make sure that people would build it right, that would follow the example, because they understood, and Jefferson says this, that the craftspeople in the colonies are not very adept at following these principles. They can't, no one can draw an order, he says, he writes. And in fact, he says, I can't even put a Corinthian capital on this building like you see in the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, because no one can actually carve one in the colonies. So he has to, unfortunately, resort to an Ionic capital, as you see here on that model. And this is this is in fact, I've thrown up the one that's the plaster model, recently restored, that you can see in the Capitol building in Richmond on display. So he uses a temple instead of a basilica as the great hall of democracy. It's a temple to democracy. He was not copying ancient architecture. He adapts it to his own purposes. The main thing is that it is a pristine example of Roman architecture, one that he can copy and take to the New World. Even in Trumbull's great Declaration of Independence of 1832, you can see that the room here, which is a fiction, he emphasizes the classical elements of the architecture that adorn the hall when this great moment takes place. And it's of course his own great moment of triumph. It's what he wants inscribed on his obelisk tombstone at Monticello. There's only a few accomplishments that he wants to point to. He doesn't point to the fact that he was president. When he designs his tombstone, he wants to be remembered as the author of the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia, Declaration of Independence, and the father of the University of Virginia. These are what he wanted to be remembered for. He's a designer. He loves designing furniture after the Greek style. He designs his tombstone, as we see there. He designs a clock with obelisks on it. Here you can see his drawing for the tombstone on the left. So he's somebody who wants classicism and classical principles to infuse all of life. And if you've ever been through Monticello, you know that he took care to perfect every little part of that house, down to the dumbwaiter, the clock, the weather vane, the skylights. He was also remarked as a lover of light and air. So he inserts his own inventiveness into his architecture. He also participates in the famous competition to design the White House. So he gets back to America, he inserts himself into that competition. He proposes probably two separate entries. There's some debate about who actually did the drawings for them. We all know who won. It was James Hoban, who provided George Washington with the one thing he really wanted, which was a room for levee, for that important ceremony. The great, I like the pomp and circumstance. Other entries were by James Diamond, not as commodious with the two staircases. Here's Jefferson's. It is not at all like Hoban's. This is a villa, and George Washington would have known instantly who had designed this, because he knew all about Jefferson's love of Andrea Palladio. So this is not at all meant to be a grand palace, although there is a second entry, we think, in which he does imitate the design of the Louvre in Paris. So he may well have submitted two separate entries, but this is the one he really bet on in this horse race. Look at that dome. It has empty slats in it. And if I blew it up, you could see it says glass. So he's got something weird here. He's got a dome with alternating slats of glass to let in light and air, but above all light. He wanted there to be light in this building. Where did he see that? Well, he saw that at the Hall de Display in Paris, the great grain exchange hall. And he wanted that in this new presidential mansion in Washington. But it's not hard to tell where he got the model from. Here's the model. Here's a wonderful architectural model of it. It's based squarely on Palladio's most important and most triumphant building, the Villa Capra on the little mountain Monticello outside Vicenza. This renowned building. How did Jefferson know it? He knew it through drawings. He knew it through the 4 books of architecture, the last of which had a lot of Palladio's designs in it. Palladio does this book late in life, so it's a bit of a cleaned up version of his own career. So you can see the resemblance here also to Jefferson's own home at Monticello. What does he do when he gets back? He tears down a lot of the house that he'd already put up. Remember how he loved pulling things down and putting things up, and starts to rebuild it somewhat after the model of Palladio's Villa Capra. The main thing is to make the house bigger. He finds that it was getting cramped. He had a lot of guests. Monticello was already a great tourist attraction during his own lifetime, but what he wants is a dome. So that's what he caps the entrance with. It's a dome made largely of wood. It's not at all like the Pantheon in Rome, which he also cites as a great model. So the villa then becomes his ideal, not the palace. It's a villa with dependencies, with farming going on. There's a great painting by Stearns that Richmond so nicely lent us. It shows Washington as a gentleman farmer. He's somebody who has slaves doing all the work while he commands them. There's Mount Vernon in the background. This is the ideal of the villa. And this is honestly what, no less, no more than what Jefferson proposed for a presidential palace with grounds and dependencies, not unlike his own house in outside of Charlottesville. But Charlottesville too is a building designed to hide the slaves. And I think this angle, this photograph, beautiful photograph recently taken, shows you just how he literally sunk the workshops, the working areas, kitchens, and a lot of the areas where the slaves lived and slept underground and on the sides of the slope. So he was somebody who, again, we see constantly having an ambivalent relationship to this institution upon which a lot of his life and his status depended. It was very hard for him to make money at Monticello. One thing he tries to do is develop a nailery. Everyone needs nails. And he was able to make money in that part of his operation. But because he was rarely at Monticello, all the work he put into developing the craft of farming went to waste. He had to hire it out to managers. Lots of parts of the operation lost money, and of course his lifestyle did not help things along. His taste for wine was mind-boggling. The vintages that he went through and ordered on a yearly basis were just astonishing. So he does try to make money, and Isaac Granger Jefferson is someone who's part of this story. He was the man, part of the larger, the Granger family, part of the slaves he inherited from his wife's family. And he was free later on, and he has himself photographed, which is an extraordinary thing. He doesn't dress up in a top hat. He has himself shown as a craftsperson, wearing his apron. We know that by this point he has his own operation as a freeman, as a blacksmith. He declares to himself there's pride in his work, and that's something that we wanted to make sure was the main message of the contribution of the enslaved population at Monticello and throughout Jefferson's lands. This is what the last great portrait by his friend Latrobe of Jefferson as a gentleman, beautiful, intimate chalk drawing, something that we put up in the exhibition opposite the Granger portrait. Well, if things get so busy at Monticello that he decides to build a second house, a retreat from his villa at Poplar Forest in Bedford, outside Lynchburg. And it's there that we get this sort of the ultimate statement, a house with a cubicle, literally cube-formed dining room. It's this gorgeous statement of the triumph of reason. It's a smaller home. He never finishes it. Famously, he builds one wing, but then the other one is literally a mound of earth with a copse of trees to imitate the other side. Loves nature. He's not embarrassed about this at all. So this is an important architectural statement. He still has the octagonal form, but it's a smaller home, a retreat from the busyness at Monticello. One of the doors here, again, because Poplar Forest is being renovated and partly being left unfinished, some of the original doors are not installed, and we're owe a great debt of thanks to our friends at Poplar Forest for lending us one of those doors that they discovered was made by the same tools and therefore by the same person at John Hemmings has made the doors at Monticello. An astonishing statement of the presence of one of these nameless craftspeople who now does live on and who we can understand through his work here. The joinery at Monticello was never a place for fine furniture, that the kind you could see made in Philadelphia, but it made a lot of inventive custom furniture and cabinetry for his own house and for the estates around Charlottesville. This is an example from the collection at Colonial Williamsburg. So Jefferson's last great project, his great statement, is the University of Virginia, this what was called Central College, and he spends a great deal of time and effort designing it as a academical village. And you'll see peeking over there on the right is his Pantheon, based on Palladio's design, but also based on the great Roman Pantheon, the temple still intact in Rome, in which you can fit a perfect sphere with its temple front and dome, a great Roman building. Again, he doesn't use it as a temple. There is no theology on this campus by design, but it's the library. Notice how every one of the pavilions is different. He never publishes a book of architecture. This is his book of architecture. And he intended to train architects here and send them into the world as practitioners of classical architecture. And in this he succeeded. Certainly Blackwood is one of the great examples of this, and a Virginia architect, builder who trained here and then went on to build many, many neoclassical buildings in the Palladian style, carrying with him his own handwritten copy of Palladio's 4 books to guide his career. So it was his intention not just to educate gentlemen in liberal arts here and in medicine, but also to educate builders to beautify the colonies. Here you see the beautiful aerial view. So you don't notice the different pavilions right away, but they're all deliberately meant to follow different principles and offer different models for buildings throughout the colonies. It's a wonderful view. I think this, you can see in the background, I think that's in the background is Monticello. The idea is that you could see one spot from one of his buildings from the other. Again, he had these models like Chiswick in England to follow, stately homes, but he's more interested in his architectural legacy. Of course, his legacy is also slavery. Here's Lucy Cottrell, one of the slaves who was at Monticello. She, after the estate was broken, Monticello was broken up after his death. She was sold and ended up laboring for one of the professors at the University of Virginia, just a few steps away. Astonishingly enough, she was also had a daguerreotype made of her, not on her own expense, of course, but she's also memorialized in a photograph. So it's astonishing that we still have these connections, that we can still make these leaps across time to look at the lives of the people who formed the vast majority of the people present at those great estates. Some wonderful fragments that have been left behind of their work at the site. And our friends at the university have reconstructed the original wall in a digital format, the original walls at the university, to give us a sense of just how slaves worked and were enclosed and hidden also here at the university in the back yards, which had entrances into kitchens that did not have access to the front. So there were two separate lives here that were led. Again, this is the model that Jefferson could never have seen. He never made it to Italy, and on his grand tour of Europe, he was not able to go any farther than Milan and Genoa. So he was not ever able to make it to Vicenza or Venice to see the great buildings that he had so admired in books. But by that time, he was his own man and probably didn't feel the impulse to go see them himself. He already knew them because he lived them had lived them through the books and had seen the best Roman ruins that one could have seen anyway. So again, he did collect other books, so he knew what the Pantheon looked like from Day, for instance, and we have his accounts of all the books he bought from his letters and account books and from his list of books in his library. So we know just how deeply attached he was and obsessed he was with the architecture of antiquity. And here's our great Robert painting, which shows the ideal of the experience of a grand tourist, an English gentleman who would have gone and bought a Robert painting. Here you see the Colosseum and the Pantheon improbably joined together. They're several miles apart. But this is the kind of memory that an English young gentleman would have taken back with them of the glories of Rome, something that Jefferson did not allow himself to do. He writes back to Maria Causeway how provoking it was that he could never have made the trip. He was just days away from being able to go to Rome and Venice, but he kept his dance card full of missions that related to the future of the colony, finding out where to get rice, getting grape plantings and cuttings, and ordering pieces of architecture books, and learning all the things he would need to know to make his own creation, the state of Virginia and the colony stronger and the democracy stronger. So that's our trip through Thomas Jefferson, architect. Thank you so much for joining me. There's lots more detail, a lot of stories that can be told, but the main thing is that Jefferson is someone who's a complicated figure. Our title is complicated. He's a complicated man. He's a paradox, but his gift to the nation is not just political, it's also in the beauty that he bestowed on it in providing these great models for architecture. So thank you very much.
Lloyd, that was a phenomenal presentation. I believe you have one question. I have actually a few questions, so I'm going to back off. You answer the questions, and I'll catch up with you in just a minute. Thanks.
Great. I see Wendy Wincall asks, do you have a favorite book on Jefferson's life to recommend? I have to say I really loved Confounding Father, a recent book that tells you a lot about Jefferson's political identity. And beyond that, McLaughlin's book on the whole history of Monticello is a fascinating book. So those are the ones that I thought were my favorites. And getting along with Latrobe, it's not something that we delved that deeply into in our project, but you can see that Latrobe was clearly the professional builder and somebody who had a career. It was a trained architect and somebody who clearly was at odds with Jefferson at some point, but they both share this great mission of bringing classical models to the new country, and by above all using these as the models for the key, most important buildings, the houses of democracy. So the idea that Capitol in Richmond was a temple to memorialize George Washington. That never comes out in Jefferson's writings. It certainly is the appearance that you get. It's certainly the sensation you get when you go there now. But bear in mind how large the other works of art are in the building. And I think lionizing. Remember, Jefferson, when he's in France, has the great French sculptor Houdon, whose bust is on our show. Do not just busts of Washington and himself, but also other great founding fathers. So there was no sense in which that Jefferson lionized Washington. You know, of course, famously they were at odds, politically, and that I think that sense of tension, to my mind, and just in the architectural debate, comes through very clearly. So I think. It's hard to escape that sensation when you go there today to the Capitol and see the big statue. But in fact, at the time, I think he was much more concerned about providing the state and the new republic with a choice morsel, as he calls it, a classical model. It's the building itself that's the most important contribution. Slaves learned their craft. Slaves learned their craft from often from their highly trained white craftspeople that would come by, and you can see how Jefferson himself ensures that he's very selective about the people that he places with the white craftspeople, Dinsmore and others, so that they learn their craft. And he's has Sally Hemings' brother trained as a chef in France. He's very, very alert to exactly who learns which skill and what they bring back with. That's a great question. Beyond that, a lot of the enslaved craftspeople have to learn their craft by hook or crook, but and catch as catch can. There's a lot of ambitious young people there who insert themselves into different parts of the operation. What's astonishing is the dominance of the Hemings family and how they essentially manage and control the huge parts of the operation at Monticello and also at Poplar Forest. It's quite a story. Let's see, I've got, Jefferson frequently make an effort to see a particular building as it's situated in nature rather than, we don't have any sense that he was able to understand what Palladio's buildings look like in nature. They just weren't published that way. I don't think we have a single example of that. So when he goes to England, it's quite a shock when he sees just how these estates are situated in nature and how they respond to it. He's fascinated by this, and he tries to, as much as possible, design Monticello to respond to nature, and certainly Poplar Forest. But the great model that he follows, that of Palladio, there are not really good sources for him to understand exactly how those buildings were situated in their environment. And if you have ever done a kind of Palladio tour, I highly recommend, you will see just this responsiveness to nature is really incredible part of Palladio's career. Have you seen many examples of Jefferson of designs that reflected his reliance on books as opposed to seeing them in person? Yeah, I think Monticello is widely acknowledged to be built out of books. And others describe it that way. That was his process. That's his thinking process. We have all his drawings. This guy did not throw away anything. No accounts. He's drawing. So in the Massachusetts Historical Society, there are just many drawings that show his process. He even uses footnotes to tell us where he got his architectural ideas from. So he's marvelous that way. But when he gets to France, he changes. So you got before and after that. And then you see him carrying ideas with him that he had seen in person. And then he understood how things were situated in nature. And certainly the Hotel de Somme is one of those. He bought a print of the Hotel de Somme and took that back with him. We know that. We know what his print collection and his all these maps and books and guidebooks that he bought. Lucinda Lester asked the Confounding Father. Confounding Father was the name of the book I recommended. Great. Why was Jefferson so opposed to more conventional argument, user-friendly stairs? Grand staircases were undemocratic. They belonged to kings. That's my sense of why he hid the staircases and tucked them away so maddeningly at Monticello. It really is hard, makes it very hard for people who struggle with mobility to get up to the second floor. But he had a very, very democratic rationale for hiding those stairs. And it was a political, to my mind, political and aesthetic. It also opened much more room for the display of that astonishing collection of his. He was a collector. He had ancient sculptures, not a lot, and all the Lewis and Clark material on display. They presented that very faithfully, to what you see today at Monticello. More room to see stuff. And again, it's light and air are another thing that meant if you didn't have a big staircase in the way, the light you could see from front to back. So great questions. And I'm looking to see if I've missed anything here. Why did he not write about architecture or publish a book? He considered, that's Bridget O'Brien, oh, sorry, that's William Womack. He considered his text to be the University of Virginia. And it's like a textbook. It has all the different examples. It dictates his principles, and he himself used it like a textbook. He himself trained the builders there to copy Palladio. So even at the end of his career, he goes back to Palladio, and he's telling his builders, copy Palladio, carry it around with you. So we had on display Blackwood's very idiosyncratic and wonderful copies, handwritten copies after Palladio's 4 books. Great. Yes, one of the first structures at Monticello was one of the wing outbuildings, and we know that he brings his young bride there, and they live basically in something no larger than a garage. And starting small with a big vision. Look, that house was never finished. What you see today, Jefferson never saw. He was always tearing things down and building them up. And when the visitors to Monticello describe a mess, but a mesmerizing mess, because it was the mind of this great architecture. He's a genius type of person in the sense that he's an extraordinarily creative person, but he's always changing his mind and editing himself. And that's, I think, part of the experience that people had back then that we can't even conceive of, planks and boards and a brickyard. That's what most people experienced when they visited Monticello. Might have underside of the dome of Scamozzi's Villa Pisani as the design, striped in a similar way with solid but not glass info. Probably, yes. No, he did know that. Yes, I think he was aware of. He was very conversant on how Scamozzi himself reworked Palladio's design. Scamozzi is Palladio's pupil, his greatest follower, and somebody who literally finished a lot of his buildings afterwards, and was in many ways a much more practical architect than Palladio. Great. Any builders or architects in the colonies that influenced the young, certainly I don't know, it's escaping me, the builder of the Redwood Library, somebody who certainly influenced the young Jefferson, and all the people who had knowledge of English architecture, who he learned from at the College of William and Mary. Although he didn't like the buildings there were certainly a lot of very educated people who had experience of European architecture and classical architecture, and we know that they were key influences on his life. And somebody who showed him that there was this beautiful world out there, especially in Italy. The Uriah Levy restoration. Uriah Levy is this astonishing young Navy captain, Jewish, who so admires Jefferson that he buys Monticello and lives there with his family and allows visitors to to come and go. He sees Monticello already early on as a monument to the politics and thinking of Jefferson as a great hero. So the leaving moment is a very important moment in the history of restoration, but he does change the house. And good thing we have all the drawings and clever people that we've been able, that the house could be brought back again to its current state. But Levy did not, and his heirs did not do anything beyond what anyone else did at the time. Did Jefferson honor Sally Hemings in any way? I can't find any way he honored her. She was one of the most famous women. Yes.
Just want to say we're running out of time. So if you can, one more question. We'll
I did get the Sally Hemings question. I was always shocked. There's no portrait of Sally Hemings, but you know from the controversies when she returned, the scallywag tried to scandalize Jefferson, but telling us things that were probably well known at the time. So it is always disappointing, in spite of the fact that it seems his second family was entirely with her, that he left no portrait or any other way to honor her. But he did. All of her children end up being freed, and that's what the promise he made already in France,
right,
where she was briefly freed. So, all right, well that's it. Thank you, Jim.
Lloyd, that was remarkable. My head is still spinning. I'm admittedly a 19th century Lincoln guy, but I'll tell you, 18th century Jefferson, quite a challenge. So I would encourage everybody to go to the Big A Amazon and buy the book. Just look for Lloyd DeWitt or Thomas Jefferson Architect. You'll see the book. It's phenomenal. And Lloyd, we cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your evening to spend the time with us and giving us a greater insight into Thomas Jefferson, his architecture, but also his own personal philosophies about architecture and how it affected his politics and his life. So amazing in self. So for those of you who are still listening to me, I would like to encourage you to join us tomorrow night for a Legacy Foundation Public Affairs program on the Constitution and COVID-19. We'll see how those dots connect, and I'm sure that there quite a few of them do. So we'll see what happens with that. Next Wednesday, the 30th, we are incredibly, forgive me, the 20th. We are incredibly lucky to have the Attorney General for the state of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, as our guest. And you can imagine how busy he is and all the things he's dealing with. So that should be a remarkable program by itself. And then the week after that, on Wednesday, May 27th, will be our monthly Civil War Roundtable with Dr. Elizabeth Varon, formerly of Temple University, but now of the University of Virginia. Amazing how those dots connect. And she will talk about her new book called Armies of Deliverance, A New History of the Civil War. And amazingly enough, there's still new stuff about the Civil War. So there's 3 great programs for the rest of the month. We've had great audiences, great conversations, great questions. So please join us. And Lloyd, thank you once again for just a remarkable program. And thank you to the Union League Legacy Foundation and to the Institute of Classical Architecture of Art for co-sponsoring this program tonight. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all. Stay safe and stay well. Good night. Lloyd, can you hear me, Lloyd?
Hello.
Hey, that was great.
Well, thank you.
No, seriously. I wrote a question, but it didn't get to it. But I'm a former board member at the Woodlands in Philadelphia, where Jefferson was a guest many, many times of William Hamilton and